What if Goku landed in the boys' Dark Version episode 2? Let's get to it. It's going to be talking about the Vought growing pains. So let's go. The Vought stealth helicopter cut through the dawn, the smoldering ruin of the Nebraska facility shrinking into the mere scar on the earth below. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken truths. Kakarot and John sat on the plush leather seats, still clad in stolen and torn garments, their small frames dwarfed by the luxurious interior. Across from them, Edgar reviewed a tablet, his demeanor as calm as if he was reading a quarterly report, despite the circumstances. The two boys didn't speak. They didn't need to. The shared experience of the last hour had linked them more profoundly than any childhood game ever could. They had both been caged animals, subjected to the cold curiosity of men in lab coats. They had both been abandoned, Kakarot through the systematic torture system, and John through being literally left behind in a panic after the Ozaru outbreak. And they had both been saved by the same cataclysm, which was Kakarot's primal and terrifying power. John glanced at Kakarot, his eyes wide with a mixture of residual terror and burgeoning hero worship. This boy, this force, had not just escaped his own prison. He had shattered John's as well with a casual, contemptuous punch. In John's mind, Kakarot was strength personified. Kakarot in turn looked at John and saw something equally valuable. Confirmation. He was not alone. There were others like him, others the white coats had wanted to break, to experiment on. John's presence validated Kakarot's rage. It wasn't just his personal suffering. It was a system, and John was another victim of it. The word friend he had offered was less about affection and more about a strategic alliance. A pack of two was stronger than a lone wolf. Edgar looked up from his tablet, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He saw the silent communication between the boys, the way John suddenly leaned toward Goku, the way Kakarot's posture was slightly less defensive with John nearby. The old methodology was wasteful, Edgar stated, breaking the silence without raising his voice. They saw you as specimens. I see you as untapped potential. The world out there is full of chaos, of weak people pretending to be strong. We will give you the platform to show them what real strength looks like. You will never be in a cage like that again. You will be the ones who hold the keys. He wasn't offering kindness, he was offering a deal. Power in exchange for loyalty. Freedom as defined and curated by Vought. And in the ashes of their old lives, two children who knew only pain and betrayal. It sounded like the only truth left in the world. Their friendship, a dark sapling nurtured in a lab, was now being deliberately watered by the most dangerous man on the planet. The new facility was a different kind of cage, larger, cleaner, filled with training equipment instead of torture devices. But a cage nonetheless in Kakarot's eyes. In Kakarot's eyes, dark and perpetually wary, scanned every room for threats, every smiling scientist for a hidden syringe. Edgar's promises echoed, but promises were just words, and words were the first tool of liars. His trust in John, however, was not born from Edgar's speeches, but from cold, empirical evidence. It happened in a high training auditorium. Scientists kept at a respectful distance beyond a polycarbonate wall observed as John was put through his paces. Subject A. Retinal beams begin. John, eager to please, clenched his small fist. His face tightened with concentration and a low hum filled the air. Then, with a thin beam, a control red laser erupted from his socket, striking a reinforced target dummy and sending it skidding backwards. The scientist nodded, making notes. Force output is 8% higher than baseline. Excellent. Kakarot, observing from the corner, didn't care about the percentages, but he saw the effects. He saw the concussive force, the raw power that wasn't derived from the broken bones and searing pain, but from something that was innate within the boy. In that moment, John was not a victim. He was a weapon just like him. Later, during a strength assessment, John struggled to lift a colossal weight, so frustration turned to panic, and a single hot tear traced the path down his cheek. Instinctively, two thin crimson beams shot from his eyes, slicing the weight support cables with surgical precision. The rooms fell silent. Kakarot's eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in calculation. I've seen it twice now. He could project energy, and it seems his emotions fuel his power. This was data. This was understanding. He was already getting good at analyzing people at his early age. He didn't approach John to comfort him. He approached him as a strategist. Your eyes, Kakarot stated flatly. Can you control the heat? John startled, sniffled, and shook his head. Not always. Kakarot gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a flaw, but a manageable one. He saw in John not a friend in the emotional sense, but a compatible piece of hardware. He was powerful, his abilities were useful, and his emotional fragility made him predictable. In the sterile, treacherous world of Vought, that was the most reliable foundation for confidence one could hope for. Stan Edgar observed the boy's dynamic with the cold eye of a master chess player. The bond forming between Kakarot and John was not a heartwarming story of friendship per se. It was a consolidation of power, and a dangerous one. Kakarot was the engine, a feral, unpredictable source of pure power whose resentment was a smoldering fuse that was noticeable to everyone around him. John was the stabilizer, but also the amplifier. His loyalty and emotional dependence on Kakarot gave the Saiyan a cause beyond himself, a reason to focus his rage. Together they were a self-contained, mutually reinforcing unit that answered only to each other. This was an unacceptable corporate risk. Edgar's strategy was not one of brute force, of course, which he knew would only strengthen their defiance. Instead, he implemented a policy of sophisticated, deliberate fragmentation. It began subtly. Their shared living quarters were separated. Kakarot was moved to a suite adjacent to the high-intensity training chamber, its decor Spartan and industrial, emphasizing function and power. John was given a room in a wing overlooking the city, filled with comforts, posters, and popular Vought heroes, and a state-of-the-art entertainment system, an environment designed to foster a desire for the adoration and normalcy that Vought could provide. Their schedules were meticulously crafted to ensure minimal overlap. While Kakarot was subjected to controlled high-stress scenarios to trigger his Zenkai boost, facing off against automated drones and prototype weapons, John was enrolled in a heroic dialect and public relations, learning how to smile for cameras and craft a compelling soundbite. Their instructors were carefully chosen. Kakarot's combat trainers were cold, professional, and relentlessly demanding, reinforcing the world as a place of harsh challenges. John's primary mentor was a kindly, fatherly-like figure who was also a scientist, who praised his control and spoke of the great hero he could become, a stark contrast to the clinical abuse of his past. Edgar would occasionally orchestrate chance meetings, but only under controlled circumstances that sowed the seeds of divergence. He would pull John aside after a successful public simulation and say, "Impressive control today, John. You're showing a maturity that is rare. It would be a shame if undisciplined outbursts were to jeopardize the public's trust in you." The message was clear. Kakarot's raw fury was a liability to John's potential acceptance. He was systematically rebuilding their worldviews along different axes. Kakarot's around strength through conflict, and John's around strength through approval. He wasn't just separating them physically. He was ensuring that their paths to power would, in time, become almost incompatible. Stan Edgar did not make decisions based on sentiment. He made them based on cold calculus of risk and return on investment. The incident in Nebraska had proven two things. Subject K, Kakarot, was the single most valuable asset that Vought had ever stumbled upon, and he was also the most volatile. The scientists saw a specimen, the security team saw a threat. Edgar saw something else entirely, a perfect, uniformed weapon if handled correctly. He observed the boys' training sessions from his office, watching the feeds with a detached focus. At 10 years old, Kakarot was a storm of controlled violence. He didn't train to impress or to please. He fought with brutal, analytical efficiency, learning from every block strike, adapting to every new weapon system with an unnerving speed. Unlike every other supe, especially the profoundly needy homelander, Kakarot displayed a complete and total indifference to the applause of technicians or the fearful respect of his combat instructors. He didn't crave their validation. He consumed their challenges and discarded them. This was the critical distinction. Homelander's power was shackled to a bottomless pit of emotional need. He was a god who demanded worship, a strength that was brittle because it was defined by external affirmation. You could control Homelander by simply threatening to take away the love of the crowd, the image he so desperately clung to. Kakarot was different, however. His drive was completely internal. It was cold. It was a cold engine that ran on a mixture of survival instinct and a simmering intellectual rage. All right, with a desire to always become better. He understood the concept of strength, not as a social ranking, but as a fundamental state of being. He didn't want to be seen as the strongest, he simply needed to be the strongest. A distinction that made him, in Edgar's eyes, far more sane and predictable than the emotionally stunted Homelander. And so Edgar made an unprecedented decision. He would personally oversee Kakarot's development, not only out of paternal instinct, but because he was the only one at Vought who possessed the requisite lack of emotion and a long-term strategic vision to do everything properly. Their first official meeting in Edgar's office was a study in contrast. The boy, still small for his age, but radiating a dense, palpable energy, stood before the immense desk. He didn't fidget. His dark eyes weren't wide with wonder at the opulence. They were analyzing, assessing the man before him as a potential threat or a resource, and he wondered if there were traps in there. Kakarot, Edgar began, steepling his fingers. The men who hurt you are gone. What remains is opportunity. You have a capacity for growth that is, as far as we can tell, limitless. But power without direction is noise and wasted potential. Kakarot said nothing, his gaze unwavering. I am not going to train you to fight, Edgar continued. The androids and drones will do that. I am going to teach you why you fight. I am going to teach you about the world you will one day dominate. It is not a world of simple battles. It is an ecosystem of influence, fear, and commerce. Strength is not just the power to break things. It is the power to decide what gets broken and what is allowed to stand. He saw a flicker of understanding in the boy's eyes. This was not a language of pain or punishment. It was a language of cause and effect, of strategy. It appealed to the cold, logical core that the Sand's torture had forged. You will continue your physical training, Edgar stated, but you will also spend 2 hours with me, every day. We will discuss history, economics, the psychology of weak men who pretend to be strong. You will learn that the most effective application of power is often the one that doesn't require you to throw even a single punch. But Goku wasn't really interested in that part. Or Kakarot, I should say. A slow, deliberate nod from Kakarot. It wasn't gratitude, it was acknowledgement. He saw in Edgar a different kind of strength, one of the mind, of absolute control. And in his world where strength was the only true currency, that made Stan Edgar the first non-powered person he had ever met who was worth even listening to. It was the beginning of a terrifying mentorship, the corporate king and the primal weapon, each seeing in the other the perfect tool for their own dark ambitions. Hanging out with Stan Edgar, Goku even began to wear a suit with a red bow tie, a black suit with a white collar shirt underneath. By their mid-teens, the sterile corridors of the Vought Black Site facility were a known kingdom to both Kakarot and Victoria Newman. Both were proteges of Stan Edgar, yet their apprenticeships were a study in opposites. Kakarot's was a physical, overt thing of shattered training drones and pressure-adjusted chambers, his power a roaring inferno that could not be hidden when he wanted to release it. Victoria was an education of whispers, of political theory and the precise, invisible application of force with the power of blood manipulation. Their relationship did not begin with friendship, but with a silent mutual assessment in one of Edgar's strategy sessions. He would present them with complex problems, a hostile senator, a rival corporation, an eternal leak. Kakarot's solutions were brutally direct, a path of maximum force. Newman's were elegant, surgical, leaving no trace of her involvement, but every now and then she would pop heads with her blood manipulation and leave a bloody mess to send message. They never competed. Instead, they observed. Kakarot saw in Newman the embodiment of the lessons Edgar taught him, that a single precise pressure point could be more devastating than a city-leveling blast. She was strength of a different kind, one that moved unseen through the world of weak men they were taught to manipulate. Newman, in turn, saw in Kakarot the ultimate contingency. He was not a blunt instrument like Homelander with a insane ego, prone to emotional tantrums. He was a focused storm, a final argument that could be deployed when all subtlety failed. He was the unspoken threat that gave her political scalpels true weight. Their interactions were minimal, yet profound. Passing in the hallway, they would exchange a glance, not a greeting. It was a transaction of recognition. He was her shield against a world of direct threats. She was his poison in the shadows, eliminating problems before they ever reached a scale that required his intervention. They were the two most dangerous people in any room. He for the power to erase the room itself, and she for the power to make it erase itself. All right, by causing people to implode. All while smiling for the cameras. They never spoke of this understanding. It was simply a fact, as immutable as gravity itself, and the foundation of the most formidable alliance Stan Edgar had ever engineered himself. The door to Kakarot's private training chamber hissed shut, the sound of the magnetic locks engaging with a final resonant thud. The room was a brutalist cube of reinforced steel, scarred and dented from the countless sessions. In the center, Kakarot, now 14 years old, and possessing a lean, densely muscled frame, stood bare-chested, his eyes dark and devoid of the light that should fill a teenager's. It was fixed on a hydraulic piston, arm tipped with a solid tungsten block. This was his ritual. With a voice command, he initiated the sequence. The piston retracted, hummed with built-up kinetic energy, and then slammed forward with the force of a main battle tank's cannon. It struck him square in the chest, and then it just kept doing it over and over again. The sound was sickening. Wet crunch of cartilage and bone, unmistakably the sound of ribcage fracturing. He was thrown backward, skidding across the floor to a slam against the far wall eventually. He lay there for a moment, gasping, a trickle of blood tracing a line from his lip. A normal person would be screaming, or unconscious, or even dead. A flicker of a smile touched Kakarot's lips, however. He pushed himself up with one arm cradling his torso. He could feel the bone fragments grating, the fiery agony spreading through his nervous system. He didn't fight it. He welcomed it. This was the one constant he had carried from the hell of his infancy. The Whitecoats had discovered the principle, but he had mastered the application. They had inflicted pain for data. He now sided for transcendence. The pain was a brutal, honest teacher. It was a whetstone upon which his very cells were sharpened. In the sterile, duplicitous world of Vought, where Stan Edgar spoke in riddles of influence and Victoria Newman killed with a thought, this was a truth he could feel in his marrow. The agony was a promise, a covenant between his body and the universe that stated, endure this, and you will be remade. You will be greater. He sat in the center of the room, focusing his breathing, meditating on the injury. He could feel the cellular machinery of his Saiyan biology engaging, the frantic, miraculous work of reconstruction. It was a feeling more intimate than any touch he had ever known. In the deep, silent recesses of his mind, a part of him had not just accepted this cycle, but had begun to crave it. The pain was the only relic of his past that he cherished, the one thing that was truly wholly his. It was the crucible that forged him, and in its searing embrace he felt more alive, more real, and more powerful than at any other time in his life. The pain was no longer just a means to an end. It was a dark and devoted form of self-love, because he had become a victim of his experimental, violent upbringing. Stan Edgar, ever the pragmatist, saw value in exposing his premier asset to the full spectrum of Vought's product line. What began as simple logistical accompaniment, Kakarot standing silently in the background, during Edgar's inspections of other black site facilities, evolved into a chilling new phase of the Saiyan's education. Kakarot was no longer just a subject or a student of corporate strategy. He became a connoisseur of power. He would watch, his expression unreadable, as other soups demonstrated their abilities. He saw a man who could turn his skin to shimmering diamond, another who could vibrate through solid matter, and countless variations of energy projection and enhanced physiology. At first, the other soups saw him as just Edgar's quiet, strange shadow that changed during a visit to a high-energy physics lab attached to the soup's training. The soup, Luminosity, was demonstrating his signature photon torpedo, a complex sphere of hard light energy he could barely control, requiring immense concentration and specific hand placements to form. Kakarot watched the entire tedious process once. Then he raised his own hand. There was no dramatic pose, no incantation. A sphere of raw, crackling yellow energy, far less refined but exponentially more violent, bloomed in his palm. It wasn't a photon torpedo, it was something cruder, more potent, a bastardized version that ignored the complex physics in favor of pure, overwhelming force. He had understood the concept of contained energy projection and had replicated the function through the sheer brutal output of his own understanding of his key energy source, which he had really no understanding of. It just came natural in a way. This became his new obsessive calculus. He didn't just see powers as tricks. He saw them as maybe a biological or energetic principles to be reverse engineered. He observed a soup who could fly by manipulating gravitational fields. Kakarot didn't understand the science, but he understood the sensation of the energy signature. Days later, during a high-stress training session, he simply rose, not with grace, but with a raw, explosive burst of energy that shattered the windows of the observation deck. His method was less flight and more of a form of sustained violent propulsion, but it achieved the same result. This talent for mimicry was not perfect replication. It was brutal. It was a brutal Saiyan adaptation. Each new ability was not a new tool, but a new facet of his core power, which was his ki, being forced into a different power source, or a different power ability, I could say. It was a terrifying display of potential, and it stroked a deep, insatiable hunger within him. He began to see every soup not as just a person, or not as just a weapon, but as a living textbook, their unique abilities a chapter to be studied, mastered, and then surpassed, if he could, with his own dark burgeoning power. Stan Edgar watched the development with a rare, genuine smile. His weapon was not just growing stronger, it was learning to innovate without even getting instruction. And by the time he was 15, Kakarot's reputation within Vaught's black site facilities was a thing of quiet dread. He was no longer just the asset, but a force of nature that other soups learned to avoid. His assessments were brutally simple, delivered in a flat, declarative tone that brooked no argument. Weak, he'd state, dismissing a soup who could shatter concrete with his fists. The label was a death sentence for their standing in his eyes, and they all knew it. It was during one such dismissal that the pattern broke. He had just effortlessly disarmed and pinned a soup who could generate localized force fields, contemptuously labeling him as he walked away. A new voice, sharp and laced with a challenge he had never heard before, cut through the sterile air. "And what word would you have for me?" He turned to see a girl perhaps a year or two older, with a defiant glare that was utterly devoid of the fear or posturing that he was accustomed to. This was Queen Maeve. Without a word, she launched herself at him. The fight was not like the others. She was not a puzzle of energy to be decoded or a power set to be mimicked. She was a brawler, a warrior with raw, powerful strength. Her technique honed and practical, born of grit that Vought science could not manufacture. She met his overwhelming power not with a matching flare of energy, but with sheer unadulterated tenacity. She used the environment, her leverage, and a stunning tolerance for pain to stay in the fight, far longer than any soup he had faced this far. He still won. It was inevitable, of course. But his victory was not the clean, clinical affair he was used to. In the final exchange, as he moved to subdue her, she sacrificed her guard, tanking a blow to the ribs to deliver a perfectly timed, devastating headbutt. A sickening crunch echoed in the training room. Kakarot staggered back, not in pain, but in shock. He reached up, his fingers coming away smeared with crimson from his own nose, now sitting crooked on his face. A sensation bloomed there, a real honest-to-God injury. And then he smiled. It was a small foreign thing, but it was the first genuine, uncalculated expression many had ever even seen on his face. "You broke my nose," he stated, the words carrying a tone of profound respect. "Yeah," Maeve spat, clutching her own side. "Now what's your word for me?" He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a set of abilities, but as a person who had measured herself against him and left her mark. "What is your name?" he asked. From that day, a line of contact remained open. Their encounters were sporadic but intense, not friendly chats, but a silent acknowledgement between two predators in a world of sheep. They would sometimes spar, and he would never hold back, but he no longer called her weak, or he didn't consider her one of the weak. In Maeve, Kakarot had found the only thing in this corporate world that deserved his respect, which was a fellow warrior. Stan Edgar noted this unique relationship with clinical interests. Every weapon he knew needed a whetstone. At 18, the asset was given a name for public consumption: Apex. It was a title crafted by Vaught's marketing team, a word that implied an ultimate unchallengeable peak. For Kakarot, it was merely a call sign, a label as functional as the black, non-reflective tactical gear he wore on his missions. He was Stan Edgar's special operative, a scalpel for problems too dangerous for the public. Theatrical heroes, like people like the Seven, which were developing. His missions were simple, clinical, and brutal. The elimination of rogue soups. These were assets who had become liabilities. Those who threatened to expose Vought's secrets, challenged its authority, or whose powers had metastasized into something uncontrollably destructive. Edgar would deliver the dossier. Apex would study it with the detached focus of a technician reviewing a schematic. There was no moral calculus, no moment of hesitation. To him, these rogues were not people. They were malfunctioning products, and his function was to recall by annihilation. He would arrive on site without fanfare. There were no quips, no warnings, no offers of surrender. He was a force of nature made manifest. A soup who could generate impassable force fields would find Apex simply standing inside it with them, having moved faster than the thought to activate it. Another who possessed corrosive touch would watch stunned as Apex had created an energy shield around his arm, his expression never changing before he delivered a fist right through their chest as his hand formed a yellow energy blade. He never took pleasure in the act per se, though he did take pleasure in combat. But it was not the act of killing them, especially because most of them never put up much of a fight, nor did he seem to despise it. It was a task, a necessary function in the ecosystem of power that Stan Edgar had taught him to maintain. Each mission was a verification of his own superiority and a reminder of the consequence of failure within the system. He was the final unanswerable argument of the corporation, a ghost in the machine whose only purpose was to delete other errant codes, and he never, ever missed. Between missions, a new perplexing variable entered Kakarot's life. John Gilbin, now publicly known as Homelander. As young adults, Homelander, reveling in his status as Vought's golden boy, took it upon himself to show Apex the ropes of the world they were destined to rule. This largely involved dragging him to the lavish, decadent parties that populated the lives of Vought's elite soups. The experience was an anthropological study for Kakarot. The penthouse suites were a sensory assault of pounding music and strobing lights and a thick smell of expensive alcohol, pheromones, and something else, something desperate. He stood against a wall, a silent monolith in the chaos, a glass of water in his hand, untouched, as he observed everything around him. Homelander was in his element. He was the sun around which these lesser planets orbited. A dazzling practiced smile was permanently fixed on his face as he accepted praise, told sanitized war stories, and held court. He would clap Kakarot on the shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a claim of ownership than real camaraderie. Live a little, Apex. Look at them all. They adore us. This is what the power is for, man. Kakarot's dark eyes scanned the room. He saw the hollow laughter of the soups, the sycophantic grins of the Vought executives, the way people flinched just slightly when Homelander's gaze fell on them, mistaking fear for reverence. He saw the transactions happening in the shadows, whispered deals, the trading of favors, the performance of friendship that was as real as a movie set. To Homelander, this was the pinnacle. The adoration, the hedonism, the sheer consumption of experience was the reward for his power. It fed the bottomless hunger that was within his soul due to his emotional upbringing. His emotional childhood upbringing. Emotionally lacking, I should say. To Kakarot, it was a distraction. The music was just noise, masking weakness. The alcohol was a poison that dulled the senses. The social maneuvering was a game for those who lacked the strength to simply take what they wanted. He didn't crave adoration. He found it confusing and irrelevant. Why would he need the love of these fragile things when he could feel the cellular thrum of his own power increasing after a focused training session? The fleeting high of a drug or a random sexual encounter in some dirty bathroom was pale, a pathetic imitation of the transcendent rush of a true Zenkai boost, a feeling his bones reknit stronger than before over time. After one such party, as they stood on a balcony overlooking the glittering fake city, Homelander sighed with satisfaction. Now that's living, isn't it? Kakarot looked down at the ant-like people and blinking lights, then up at the cold, distant stars. It is inefficient, he stated, his voice flat. The energy spent on that noise could fuel a dozen power level increases through training. They are celebrating the shadow of power, not cultivating the thing itself. He turned and walked away, leaving Homelander alone with his hollow glitter. Homelander's smile tightened into a brittle mask. He could command a room, but he could never understand a friend who saw that room as nothing more than a cage of wasted potential. The sterile clinical nature of Kakarot's upbringing had not just shaped his mind, it had rewired his very understanding of pleasure and connection. For him, the line between pain and power, between trauma and transcendence, had been irrevocably blurred. This distortion seemed to enter every facet of his being, including his rare, furtive encounters with the few soup women strong enough to hold his interests. Romance, affection, tenderness, these were foreign, almost meaningless concepts. They were currencies for a world of emotion he had never been allowed to possess. Intimacy for Kakarot was not about connection, but about utility and sensation. He approached it with the same cold analytical focus he applied to combat or mimicry. The primal act was just another biological process to be optimized, and he had discovered that the most efficient catalyst for his own engagement was pain. He didn't seek pleasure in the conventional sense. He sought the sharp, clarifying jolt of discomfort, the bite of nails digging into his sand-tough skin, the crack of a well-placed blow to his jaw, the searing scratch of broken circuitry from a shattered console as he was pushed against it. In these moments of inflicted hurt, a flicker of genuine feeling would break through his perpetual calm. It was the spark of realness in this artificial world Vought had built around him. The pain cut through the noise, grounding him in a physical truth he understood intimately, that all sensation was data, and data on his limits was the only thing of true value. Apex's sexuality, like everything else, was warped by his upbringing. He felt no real romantic pull, no tender connection. What he felt was a need for intensity, for a sensation that could cut through the emotional numbness that encased him. He only found this in rough, violent encounters with powerful soup women, as stated before. During the act, he preferred partners who could and would fight back in the act. He sought out Maeve and Victoria Newman, not for romance, but for the capacity for violence. With Maeve, it was a physical contest, a brutal wrestling match of limbs and power, where punches were not foreplay, but an integral part of the act itself. With Newman, it was a colder, more internal game of psychological dominance. He only achieved release when pain was inflicted upon him. When Maeve, superhuman strength left bruises and mirror fractures, or when the sheer terrifying risk of being with Newman provided a psychological jolt due to her blood manipulation. The women involved understood the transaction well. All right. They already knew that a lot of soups were into some freaky stuff. They were using him for their own reasons, of course. Maeve for a fleeting sense of real feeling, and Newman for alliance building. They were not romantic encounters. They were mutually agreed upon battles, a way for two dangerous beings to feel something real in their manufactured lives, with Apex conditioning himself to associate pleasure with the very pain that had defined his existence. And though his preferred partners for these transactions were Maeve and Victoria Newman, not out of affection, but because of what they represented. With Maeve, it was a continuation of their sparring. Her strength was honest, her blows were meaningful. A session with her was brutal, physical dialogue, where the exchange of pain was a language mutual, grudging respect. With Newman, it was a different, colder. It was an alliance of shadows. Her calculated, precise nature meant her infliction of pain was never reckless. It was a controlled experiment, a subtle pressure applied to a specific blood vessel to gauge its reaction, a silent negotiation of their dark pact. There were others, of course, lesser soups, drawn to his power or assigned by Vought for quote-unquote stress testing. But these encounters were even more hollow, mechanical exercises that ended the moment he determined his partner could no longer provide a stimulus significant enough to register on his heightened senses. They were all transactions in the economy of sensation, and for Kakarot, pain was the only currency that held any real weight. Homelander, against all of Stan Edgar's meticulous planning, still clung to the idea that Kakarot, Apex, was his one real friend. In his mind, forged in a lab and starved for a genuine connection, their shared origin as Vought's special projects was an unbreakable chain. They were brothers in power, the only two of their kind. He would sling an arm around Apex's shoulders after a mission, beaming with a camaraderie that was as performative as it was desperately sincere. See? Us against the world, buddy. Just like always, one time at a meeting conference, he spoke to him in a whisper. "You don't care what they think of you," Homelander once said, bewildered after a public event where Apex had stood stone-faced. "Why would I?" Apex replied. "Their opinion doesn't make me stronger. It's just noise." Homelander's smile tightened. That simple alien logic was both what he admired and despised about his friend. Apex was the one person whose approval he could never truly win because Apex did not value approval at all. Their friendship was a relic, a tether to a shared horrific childhood, but it was straining under the weight of their diametrically opposed natures, which was purposefully designed by the actions of Stan Edgar. But the world they inhabited and their places within it had become a study in violent opposites. Homelander was the public face of Vought, a dazzling all-American icon. His smile was a weapon, his charm a carefully crafted tool to harvest the love and adorations of millions. He was a god who demanded worship, and his entire existence was a performance designed to elicit it. He flew through the skies not just for efficiency, but to hear the crowds roar his name from below. His power was immense, but it was a gilded cage. Every laser blast, every display of strength was tied directly to his fragile, pathological ego. His greatest weakness wasn't kryptonite or some magic word. It was a bad review, a dip in his Q rating, a single child looking at him with fear instead of wonder. His power was a feedback loop. He needed love to feel powerful, and he used his power to force the world to love him. It was a terrifying and brittle existence. Apex, on the other hand, observed this from a place of cold, alien incomprehension. He was Vought's top special operative, a ghost in the machine. Public adoration was a meaningless variable in his personal equation. The cheers of a crowd were just atmospheric noise, less impactful than the hum of a training drone that was powering up. When Homelander's power was a cry for validation, Apex's power was self-validating. His entire life had been a brutal, empirical lesson in cause and effect. He endured pain, and he became stronger because of it. He studied an opponent, and he absorbed their techniques because of it. He trained, and his power level increased because of it. This was a closed, perfect system. The strength he felt thrumming in his cells after a Zenkai boost or successful mimicry of a new technique was a tangible, undeniable truth. It required no audience, no applause, no sycophantic executive telling him he was great. It simply was what it was. He didn't need love because love was an abstract, fickle currency that offered no tangible return on investment. It couldn't shatter a mountain or allow him to survive in the very vacuum of space. A challenge, however, was a direct deposit into his account of power. A purpose, like the one Stan Edgar provided, was a direction in which to focus his ever-growing energy. While Homelander sought to consume the world with its love and attention, its very subjugation, Apex sought to measure himself against it. To Homelander, a rogue soup was a threat to his image. To Apex, it was a potential benchmark, a data point to be collected and surpassed after its elimination. This fundamental schism made their friendship quite weak. Homelander saw a brother. Apex saw a deeply flawed specimen, a powerhouse of immense energy shackled by a pathetic emotional need, a living cautionary tale of what happened when power was mistaken for purpose. He tolerated Homelander, and even valued him as an ally, in reserve not out of affection, but because Edgar had deemed it strategically useful, and because deep down on some level, he knew that a day would come where Homelander's fragile psyche would finally shatter, and it would present the most fascinating challenge for himself if he ever went rogue. The Vought Tower boardroom was a monument to corporate opulence, all gleaming chrome and panoramic views of a city that worshipped the icons the company had built. Stan Edgar stood at the head of a table, a blueprint of a new era projected behind him. The official public lineup of the Seven. Homelander, radiant in his blue costume, looked upon the holographic roster with a smile of pure, unadulterated triumph. This was the pinnacle. To be the leader of the Seven was to be the most famous, most beloved, most seen being on the planet Earth. Across the table, Kakarot, clad in his simple functional black tactical gear, observed the spectacle with detached interest of a scientist studying a particularly noisy insect colony. Edgar had presented the offer to him first, a founding seat in the Seven. It was the most coveted position in the soup world, a guarantee of global adoration and limitless commercial opportunities. Homelander had practically vibrated with excitement at the prospect. Just imagine it, Apex. You and me, side by side. The whole world will be watching. They'll build statues of us. Kakarot's response was a single flat word that sucked the air from the room. No. The silence was deafening. Homelander's smile didn't vanish, but it did freeze, becoming a brutal mask of confusion and simmering offense. No? What do you mean, no? This is the 7. I have no use for it, Kakarot elaborated, his gaze shifting from the hologram to Edgar. The uniforms are restrictive, the public appearances are inefficient, the missions, quote-unquote, you show on television are often choreographed theater. There is no strength to be gained from performing for cameras. Homelander stared, genuinely unable to process the rejection. To him, this was the entire point of their power. It was the key to the adoration that filled the hollow space inside of him. Every smile from a fan, every cheer from a crowd was a brick in the fragile fortress of his ego. The 7 was the ultimate platform, a global stage for his performance of godhood. To refuse it was not just illogical, it was just an insult to the very nature of their existence as he understood it. For Kakarot, the calculus was simple. The 7 was a gilded cage designed to placate to the masses. Its members were performers, their battles scripted events with predetermined outcomes. There was no risk, no true challenge, and therefore no growth because of it. His purpose, as defined by Edgar and his own nature, was to become stronger. That happened in the shadows on Black Ops missions where failure meant death and victory meant pushing his limits against genuinely dangerous rogue soups. It happened in the sterile silence of his training chamber where the only audience was the data on screen tracking his rising power level. The roar of a crowd was a meaningless distraction. The silent cellular hum of a Zenkai boost was a symphony. Edgar, for his part, simply gave a curt nod. He had expected this answer. Placing Apex in the 7 would be like using a scalpel to hammer a nail, a waste of its precision and a risk of exposing its true nature to the public. Homelander was the perfect frontman, a weapon that craved the spotlight. Apex was the perfect instrument of corporate will, a weapon that was content and even preferred to remain in the shadows, growing even sharper over time. Thus, the dichotomy was cemented. Homelander ascended to the very public, glittering peak of Vought's empire, a king of gilded domain, believing his friend was foolish for rejecting the throne. Apex, meanwhile, became the true, unadvertised cornerstone of Vought's real power. The silent, ever-growing threat in the basement, viewing the throne, Homelander, cherished as a decorative piece of furniture, utterly irrelevant to the true meaning of real strength. The schism between them was no longer just philosophical, it was institutional. It made their eventual and inevitable collision almost a certainty. So that'll be the end of this, man. I wanted to get to the point where they grow up together and where they ended up before the acts of The Boys Season 1, Episode 1, which we'll be getting on later. And I do plan on having a personality change for Kakarot at some point, but that'll be a thing for its own. Let me know what you guys think. Of course, as always, leave a like on the video, share all that stuff, and I'll catch y'all on the next one. Peace.